I mean, just to say, Paul is clearly completely absorbed in open-mindedly in music of all kinds. And when I was talking to him, he was talking about the Royal Academy TV film he made, and how, as he was, I think it's right to say, becoming a composer, he became fascinated by the act of making a mark on paper, which is another visceral aspect of the art of music making, marking paper. Paul.
Well, I think it's interesting at a time like this because, of course, we all come into a conversation like this with a certain sort of generation that we were in. I think it's important to say at the beginning, very much of a generation came of age sort of early 70s into the early 80s, where there was a deep craving, really, to create the future. There was a lot more thinking about what the future would be. And an almost chaste belief in progress, if you like, that one thing had led to another and that you could, however you'd come to your history, whether you'd done it academically or you'd done it yourself through your own research. And at the time, it must be said to, again, it's such a different time because, of course, we did our searching then not through Google or through the ways that searching for history and knowledge is now done, but we would do our searches almost through our favourite pop stars, so that David Bowie or Mark Bolan would become a form of search engine because if they mentioned Arthur Rimbaud or Charles Baudelaire or some obscure writer from the 30s, we would go off and find out about it. And that's how we found out about a lot of things. That was our search. And so it was kind of interesting way of constructing your knowledge and your experience. Deeply non-academic, because a lot of us, I guess, at that point as well had gone into pop music and rock music very purposefully because it seemed the most distinctive and direct way of finding an opposition to capitalist and governmental forces. And that in itself, to say that is interesting because that kind of language seems largely viewed with some suspicion in various areas these days. The idea that you have an ideological approach to the things you like as opposed to just valuing them as pieces of product that you buy in a shop. And again, that's my arrival into the cultural landscape, if you like, at a very particular period when there was an urgent need to create the future. And all the songs of the time that came up in the mid-70s, the late 70s, that got called punk, they were seen by those of us in it not as aggressive, stupid, crude acts of hooliganism, but actually quite interesting works of art that helped us locate ourselves in very uncertain times. And it was a very obvious factor that uncertainty was becoming creative energy. And so therefore they were works of art, and we had no difficulty in describing them as such. And when the arguments soon came about high art and low art, it seemed very peculiar to us because it's now more obvious in hindsight, actually, but the emergence of popular music in the 60s and then into the 70s was largely done by young people who became artists at a time when it was exciting to make your art using sound. So that a lot of that fantastic music that we think of, from Ray Davies and Peter Townsend right through to Brian Eno and David Bowie, they were in fact artists using sound to create their works of art. And those of us listening to it, there was no doubt to us that it wasn't commercial pap, it wasn't silly novelty music, although sometimes at its very best it had the quality of great novelty music. But what it was actually a soundtrack to the idea, and the idea being the thing that ultimately becomes a work of art. So it was very clear to us in that particular generation that this was the latest thing, and it was a part of a progression that had happened. And I think that sense of the future is very interesting because it largely comes about in belief and confidence in the future, and a confidence in a better future, and a belief that you can change the future. And I think in that generation, and I keep saying in that generation because I'm beginning to learn, the more of these kind of things I do, that after a while there is a tendency for people to say, oh, you're just lamenting and wishing for the good old days, as if somehow I'm being nostalgic for that time. I'm simply trying to describe it as a practical, technical thing that happened at a certain period of time, not saying, oh, I wish it was like that now, because that's not at all what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is we had a belief that the future, you could affect the future. It was naive, perhaps, it was innocent. I think sometimes highly realistic that you could kind of control the future yourself, and that you didn't have to rely on what you were taught and who taught it you and who told you and what they were saying, that you could resist it. And to some extent, that language has sort of decayed a little bit. I mean, we're obviously a country that doesn't particularly like ideas. We're obviously an anti-intellectual country, and however much niche audiences might sort of contradict that, I think in a wider sense you can see from actually how the media represents the arts and how people respond to the arts in this country. It's really is an irritant and wish they'd go away, and that's largely because they are difficult, complicated and wonderful things that really trouble people who just want to have a party and just forget their troubles. And at a time, I think, when there is such a change in our reality in the internet era, happened because the internet in a way is dominating and making changes in reality, it is interesting that what comes with that is a catastrophic loss of attention span, a kind of a reluctance really to use language that might be difficult and provocative and pretentious, if you like. I think I'll put my hand up very boldly to say that I came from a very pretentious generation, but the pretension actually was aspiration. It was ambition to achieve things, to make a difference, to actually make sure that those that obviously had the power didn't completely dominate our reality. And I think I've noticed myself, and again I say this from someone who might not be able to completely understand that the level of progress that I believe in possibly has come to an end, and that oddly enough, considering the glow of the internet, that we're on the verge of a weird kind of dark ages. But I still kind of believe in that idea of progress. So it's very disconcerting to note myself working in the media, how difficult it is really to use any kind of language that talks about, say, classical music or the arts or poetry or literature in any way other than it being decorative or something you file away on your shelves. Not actually getting inside the wildness of the imagination, the true nature of the subversion that's involved. I mean, I guess classical music came to that first because I learnt myself when I did my own little studies at the Royal Academy of Music that what had been turned into bow ties and a very formalised way of presenting the music was actually a way of tidying away the true nature of these magnificent minds. These minds were as contemporary as anything that you could imagine that had happened in the recording studio era of music, which is where my distinction comes, classical music. Classical music really only goes into the recording studio to be recorded. Everything else goes into the recording studio and sort of begins its life. And there was a sort of weird division that happened there, which is, made me forget my bloody thread. And it was a glorious thread, so please believe me, it was a glorious thread.
Dark ages.
Dark ages. No, don't send me back into the dark ages. Mm-hmm. It's, yes, what did I last say? Help me, somebody help me. Bow ties, thank you. Yes, brilliant, somebody's listening. Yes. It was just the magnificent and the greatness of the minds, and I think it is interesting and quite a metaphor for lots of ways that this country in particular treats its arts and treats its classical music. And I work in the media, and I have to own up and say that the media itself does the most appalling job in covering, describing, representing, encouraging the arts in this country, simply because it treats it as it treats everything else. It's just another section in the paper. It just gets filed away, and the language that's used to describe it is always so kind of timid and tepid and useless, and it doesn't really involve any kind of emotional response. And my attitude about whether you need to understand classical music simply because you understand the notes on the page is slightly different. That as a writer, I would love to be able to have a position where I could write about classical music in terms of how it makes me feel and how it makes me feel being alive in 2012, even if the music had been written 200 years ago, because part of its enduring beauty is that it still makes sense now, but it needs to be explained why it still makes sense now, rather than a description of how well it was played or how it fits into the canon, which I think is largely useless. I just wish there was greater dimension in the way that this music was both commissioned through the media, through the television and the radio, and talked about. I always dread the proms starting, because the voices that tell me the proms are about to start get sweeter and sweeter, and they get more charming, and basically wanting us not to be threatened by this music that it's actually very decorative. And I think you can see that in the way that a lot of classical music gets broadcast in this country, as if somehow it is just a soundtrack to your hobbies, your gardening and your knitting and your tinkering with an engine, rather than it being, you know, wildly, fantastically abstract and a key way in negotiating the turbulence of the times. So I guess I'm still clinging, even at my age, simply because of how I entered the landscape, a belief in progress, a belief that progress hasn't actually come to an end. But there are a lot of obstacles in the way of progress, because what's happened is there's been an accumulative of historical material that now we have this wonderful electronic opportunity to access this historical material. The people in control of that material seem more sinister than anyone I could ever imagine, made even more sinister by the fact that they present themselves as if they're kind of wonderful kind of post-hippies. So it just seems to be a kind of very interesting moment when the taking of control, being said by someone who believes in the idea of progress and that it is important, it seems to be that it's at its most threatened. And I always felt that great moments in history for the arts, for music, right up to popular music with Dylan in the 60s, Hendrix into the 70s, that what ultimately it was a sign of was the genius of the audience, because it needed a genius of the audience to make sure that Bob Dylan was #1 in the charts. And I'm always conscious of the mainstream world, as much as now we're very comfortable with our little niches, because I think it's the mainstream world that basically is where the history gets made. And I think it is quite interesting there, again, that anything that's challenging, strange, peculiar, is not going to be #1 in the charts anymore. And that the idea of Bob Dylan being a celebrity in a glamorous sense has been replaced by the idea of Tulisa being the celebrity. And it does require, I think, a fight back from the audience. And not the audience, the way the audience thinks it's doing with its commenting, you know, this kind of pseudo-democratization, but an urgent, more silent demand, in a way, for an increase in complexity and beauty of the debate that surrounds music and the arts. Because I think the context is what's as important as the things that are being done. So if the conversation around it gets reduced to gossip and tittle-tattle and my opinion's better than yours, then in a way that has a very, very damaging effect on the quality of the art itself, and it sinks further and further away from us and from actually having any direct impact on the progression of history.
Wonderful, thank you. So do you think there is art without ideology or without ideals?
Well, I think the best art ultimately is the most fantastic form of ideology, because it's proposing instantly an alternative, a better way, a different way, another way, a breaking through the cliche. The best art is always going to be a fight against cliche, which is inherently ideological, because the cliche creates the comfort, the cliches create the consolation. So absolutely, it has to be ideological. And I think the problem we have is that the media, worried about their own future, have withdrawn and retreated into comfort, because they're worried that if they go the other way, and I think they might as well, because their audience is being shattered anyway, but they made a decision to go into sweetness and lightness rather than to go into difficulty and complexity. And you know the idea in the 60s, you would have Burgess writing about this kind of stuff, Sontag, you know, Pauline Kael, you would have Kenneth Tynan, often in the mainstream media. Now, alas, you don't. You have people writing about this stuff in much the same way they're writing about trainers or toasters. And I think that's because the ideological nature is difficult. Yeah, it's difficult because they're worried that they're going to be extinct. And the way they're going, they're encouraging and accelerating their extinction by being so, you know, polite and friendly. Yeah.
Something that really strikes me so often is that, you know, people find it very difficult to talk about music, about the substance of music, about the music itself. So the debate about music on television is always a series of generalizations about classical music. I'm talking about now, a series of generalizations about performers, and I think that is actually in the end highly alienating. There's a wonderful Edward Said article where he talks about and that's Edward Said is another person who really, you know, talked about music, a great thinker who talked about music. But he talked about the moment where the composer and performer in classical music diverged. I mean, that's another distinction between classical music on the whole and pop music is that, you know, the performer and the composer is mostly in pop music the same person mostly, and in classical music it is now a different person. But of course, with I don't have to rehearse it with you all, but you know, with Beethoven, Liszt, Chopin, it was the same person. And the idea that the emphasis in the discussion of classical music became much more purely about the nuances of performances. And I think in the end there's only so much you can say, and so much of it what is then said to fill those endless hours on Radio 3 or Classic FM is bullshit.
I think because actually once you start talking about it how you actually feel, it becomes the kind of poetry that they don't actually want to hear.
Yeah.
So it is amazing when you hear some fantastic music on Radio 3 and then the outro or the intro is as if you've just been admiring some material in the knitting shop. You know, it's just held up to that, and that's very strange.
Searingly plangent and all that, yes.
I'd ask Mark, are we a Philistine country?
Actually, as a newcomer to classical music, I'm quite excited about actually how much access there is to it and how available it is. I think often, people who commission programs for the television really underestimate the intelligence of the audience. I think overestimate the Philistinism
Of good old England.
Yeah. We like to think we're Philistine. We're quite pleased that we're Philistine.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think we're probably not quite as Philistine as we think we are.
It's the same thing that I think most people's instinct is a craving for knowledge. It's a craving to find out. But I think what's increasingly happened is that they're being, and I'm going to sound, I was going to try and avoid this, but you can't help it. You'll notice in a minute that I do read a lot of Philip K. Dick, and I'm incredibly paranoid. But it does seem to have happened that the potential to encourage that kind of craving for knowledge, there has been some sort of movement to crush that a little bit. You know, that when I say that we're a Philistine country and that we hate intellectuals and we hate writers, which I think is true, I think that largely comes from the establishment, you know, the middle-of-the-road establishment that does control things, and they do put up a lot of deflecting shields to ensure that nobody gets access to those kind of ideas, because once people get access to those ideas, they'll be more interested in breaking down barriers rather than just worrying about the length of their eyelashes.
I think just in case we're all turning into old fogies, and in fact we're all old fogies, maybe just open up other, you know, a notion of the contemporary view of the world, the peer-to-peer world, the world of user-generated content, the world of citizen news gathering, the world of remixing, as Jan Bang was talking about earlier in his project in Norway. So is someone want to argue that there's a different kind of literacy, a different paradigm about the kind of horizontal world where there's a flurry of shared activity rather than the old vertical world where there's a tree of knowledge and experts is a horrible word, but where there is you know, a linear relationship of knowledge to who receives it rather than a more lateral one, which a lot of people will argue is the excitement of now. You know, Brian Eno has talked lately that the shift in the artist now is from architect to gardener. So the art, because of the mass of information and the mass of the ways of cultivating it, that in a way now we should move away from the 19th century model of the architect and the great composer and the lord of the manor, and we are in fact curators of stuff, and that is a different kind of literacy and a different kind of knowledge and a different kind of operation that is wonderfully of this age, perhaps someone could say.
It depends what your relationship is with that stuff, doesn't it? That's the crucial question. And I think if there's a piece of music that you discover that opens a door for you, that makes you feel in a way that you couldn't possibly have predicted beforehand, there can be a very, very intense, powerful kind of personal experience with that piece of art. And I think art is basically functional. I think it's something that we need for a certain purpose.
I mean, my political instinct wants me to want to believe in something vertical, and that everybody is an artist, and that a democratization. But my gut still feels there's something horizontal about that. There are individual men and women who have have an access, some sort of talent or genius that allows them to access something about our times and our lives that others don't have.
It is a very interesting moment that we find ourselves hesitantly working towards the idea of reinserting what we once hated, which was a kind of elitism, that there was a hierarchy, and there was people in position. I mean, a large experience I have is with pop and rock music, and there's certainly a glut of that now. There's an enormous amount of it, and 90% of it is very plausible, and it's very decorative, and it's very attractive. But because it's sort of out of context in a way, and it has no context, so if they make a hard noise, it doesn't necessarily mean there was an ideological reason for that particular noise. It's simply the noise they wanted to make. And also it lacks that final element of what happened, we now realise, in the 50 years when the system existed as it did, the recording industry, which is now gone, obviously, that there was a level of performance. And that what I'm missing on music I hear a lot is that final element of a piece of a performance. Often came in a recording studio in strange circumstances to an A&R man or to a producer or an engineer. There was a performance that got captured that was extraordinary. And because a lot of this music is now made in other ways, in other margins, although it has some value simply as incidental music to your lifestyle, so to speak, for me, it lacks that great show business achievement, that great artistic achievement, the epic quality of a performance that it is of a particular time and tells you of that time, which, of course, is going back to my belief in that one thing leads to another. And now we've entered this different zone, where absolutely, once upon a time you could hear one peer ubu, and now maybe you can hear 14,000 peer ubus. So for me, it needs a whole new set of language, a new set of moments that take the thing on further into a new level of surprise, because that stuff now is itself the cliche. So my belief is that what happens next is almost the language we're using, which is inherited from the last 50, 100, 150 years to describe very different times. We're going to need new language to describe what happens. It won't be what we're familiar with. It won't be the familiar silhouette. The way that reality has been twisted and buckled will be reflected in the art that negotiates that for us. So there will be the millions of gardeners, but there will still be the requirement of the architect. And people will still require their stars. And my worry is that the level of stars that we now get are getting weaker and weaker and weaker, because everybody's quite comfortable for looking for other things in their little niches that they've found. But it might not be important anymore. Maybe that belief in something that once seemed so important, after all that, was only for that moment of time.
And it's a rare Stravinsky that can hit the Rite of Spring in 1913, summing up the whole of the previous and next 50 years, as it were.
And weirdly, we still have that belief. In a way, that's where we say the 20th century began. It's like I'm always wondering when I'm going to be told where the 21st century has began, as opposed to it just being a big spillage, a big sort of, tidal wave of the 20th century that's just spilled over, and then we're all dealing with and having a great time because we can find it really easy, and most of it, God damn, it's free.
Yes.